I'm pleased to have with me Hanna, who's General Manager of Geneva Push. And Derek, you've been in isolation for the last 13 days. Is that right? This is your last day of isolation at the moment?
This is my last day. I've been enjoying Perth from the beauty of my hotel room for the last 14 days. So I happened to be in Bondi, unfortunately, when it exploded and things went downhill from there when I came over to Perth. So right. Last day, though. It's good. Last day.
And you're hoping to get back to Queensland as soon as possible?
Hopefully tomorrow, and hopefully they let me in, but who knows?
Well, that's certainly a prayer point for us all anyway. So, Derek, Can you tell me a little bit about Geneva Push, who you are and the vision that you have for church planting in Australia?
Yeah. So Geneva Push it's about 11, 12 years old, depending on where you started from, to Church Planting Network in Australia. More recently, it's part of Reach Australia. That's the planting arm of Reach Australia. We started about 10, 11 years ago. There's about 100 plus churches throughout the network that have planted in that time. Our vision has been to see hundreds of new churches evangelised into existence. So we want to see new churches started. We want to see multiplication, but the end goal of that is evangelism and mission. We want to see people reached, and we're committed at the start and still committed to that vision that church planting reaches new people. And so we want to keep doing that in order to reach the lost. So, yeah, that's
fantastic. Now, Geneva Push commissioned some research from Lifeway back in 2015 from memory, and it showed that in the first year of a church plant in Australia, there are on average 3 salvations per plant. In the second year, there were 3 salvations. And I think from memory, in the third year, there were 5 salvations per plant. With your focus on evangelism and missional intent, do you believe that you've seen better results than that, or are those results still being maintained?
Yeah, I think it's so that represents about, when you put it in the context of growth, those figures, it represents about 8 to 12% evangelism, raw evangelism. That is people who had no connection with church before, who weren't Christians, who became Christians. The broader statistic than that, what we see with church plants as well, is that people who have become disconnected from churches seem to drift back into church plants because there's new expressions, new ways of engaging. So when you compare that research that we did, that 8 to 12%, and you put it alongside the NCLS research as well for established churches, the comparative percentages within established churches in NCLS, they said about 6% of people in established churches 5 years ago weren't in church. So that would capture people who were new converts, also people who drifted away and came back. That's about 5-6%. Mm-hmm. What we found in the equivalent in church plants is around 30-33%.
Wow.
So it's not only the first-time converts, people who've never been exposed to the gospel, that's the 8 to 12%. It's also that bigger ring as well that we see church plants reach, of that 30-33%, so 5 times more effective often. Not always, that's a general statistic, but often church plants age new people, yeah.
That's phenomenal. That's a fantastic result, but also it really points to the fact of why we need to have new expressions of church that are enthusiastic and that are doing different things, because they're reaching different people, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's why as well we need to get our established churches firing as well. But what we do see is church plants have that effect of initially reaching new people, but also having an impact on established churches around them, that it does help fire them up.
Yeah, that's great. So you've had, I think you said, around 100 or 120 church plants that you've been working with. Do you believe that there are many more in the pipeline at the moment? Are you seeing that the pipeline is filling up, or are you finding it difficult to find new church planters to start new church plants?
It's always tricky to, I think, know what the future's going to hold. Like, that's God's domain. I'm hopeful. I'm always optimistic. I'm always hopeful. We have seen, I think, the cycle of what I think we've seen, here's me shooting from the hip of what I think we've seen. Initially in the early days of Geneva Push, and I'm sure other church plants saw that as well. I think we saw this in America. There was an initial surge of people planting. So initial surge of younger guys putting up their hand to plant in that 10, 12 years ago. I think people realised after a few years, this is really hard work. Church planting isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's not as sexy as everyone made it out to be. And so there was an initial recalibration, I think, as well as the low-hanging fruit of people who really wanted permission to do it, having done it. I think in the last few years, what we've seen is people taking stock and recapturing that vision again of the impact that church planting has. So I think I'm seeing there's a growing increase in the number of people putting up their hand to plant, people waiting a little longer to pull the trigger on that, preparing themselves a little bit more. I think I'm seeing churches as well, established churches, work out how they prepare themselves more thoroughly before they launch, which does hold back the planting a little bit. So I think in terms of, are we seeing a flood of planters? No, we need more people putting up their hand to plant church. We need more. I'm not nervous about the pipeline, but it's certainly something we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, no, that's great. So tell us about when you have someone who puts up their hand to church plant, how important is the assessment process and how do you go about that?
We found the assessment process absolutely key to getting the right people planting in the right places for the right reasons. And we want to see churches not only reach the loss that they're intending to reach. We want to see sending churches be healthy as they do it. We want to see marriages be healthy when they do that as well. So it's not just one person's vision, but as a family unit, they're together on that. They don't have to have the same role, but they're together on that. So assessment pulls those things together. A rigorous assessment helps us to get the right people planting in the right places for the right reasons. So we absolutely want to set a high bar. Look, if a plant fails, which we don't want it to fail, but if a plant doesn't get to where it needs to be, that's terrible. That's not what we want. But if a marriage fails in that process, that is a tragedy. And so assessment for us is not only about the strategy around planting, although it is that. It's about assessing the family unit, the marriage, and helping them get on the same page, as well as the planter, that they are the right person to plant with the right planting model in those kind of places. So assessment for us, we want to set a high bar for that.
That's great. Derek, tell us about the tool that you use for assessing.
We use a few tools. We've got an online assessment called the Church Planter Assessment Tool, which we've just developed recently based on the characteristics of church planters we've seen over the last 10, 12 years. That's just a very quick 20-minute self-assessment that we use to have a conversation around both the characteristic competencies of a gospel worker, as well as aligning that with some different church planting models like parachute model or mother-daughter or multi-site. So we use that as a triage. But the assessment process it's a behavioural assessment essentially. And so we gather references, we get the husband and wife in the planting team to both fill in questionnaires on that. It culminates in an interview, behavioural assessment interview with experienced planters and ministry workers in order to help them together in that room to eyeball each other, ask questions, just to gather all that information. And at the end of it's a recommendation report. But that behavioural interview is key.
So that'll be modelled, I suspect, on the Dr. Charles Ridley's work that he has done in the United States with the 13 behavioural characteristics.
Yeah, we don't use those, the Ridley ones. We've seen them, they're excellent. We haven't used them originally. We've got our own set of competencies. Right. To be honest, a lot of the competencies you see around are sourced from the same place. So he may well have been the original one. Ours are pretty more similar to the American Acts 29. Originally, we've morphed and evolved into an Australian context. But we've also done, with Lifeway you mentioned before, we did a fair bit of research with them around that study, and we used their church planning competency assessment online tool that they based research on. So we've pulled it from a few different sources and contextualised it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Now, is there any correlation that you have found between the number of people doing the assessment and whether they actually go on to do to plant a church? Have you found any average results out of that?
Yeah, well, specific 56% is the kind of that's the kind of statistic we're seeing. About 56% of people are eventually going to plant a church from our assessment process. Now, that's good and healthy. Some people do the assessment at different stages to work out whether they themselves are wise as a planter or whether as a couple that's where they want to do. And so it's a longer tail to that. Some people are doing the assessment right before they plant, so they know they're going to plant. So 56% seems to be about what we're seeing at the moment, which
Yeah.
means our vision is to see 200 more churches in the next, by 2030. So effectively, we need to run about, at this point, just shy of 400 assessments in order to get there, in order to help people think through whether they could plant a church. That's where, which is intimidating numbers, but that's where we're heading.
Because if you don't, what you've got there is a target, and if you don't have a target, you don't have the strategy, and if you don't have the strategy, you don't have the processes or the provision or the people or the prayer backing it. Those four things all end up zeroing in on the target. So it's fantastic that you've got that target. That's so encouraging to hear. Just a little aside, in terms of doing assessments, I found them so useful myself. And I remember there have been couples who have felt a deliberate call to church planting, but when we do the assessment, we've found that they'll never make a go of it as a lead planter. But we've been able to position them in a church planting team, so their call is legitimate, their call is real, but we have to have a sane estimate of ourselves in terms of putting people into the right place. Now, tell us about the coaching. Do you have ongoing coaching? Is that something that Geneva Push is big on?
Yeah, we've found as part of the network, the post-ball actually leading up to planning. So our hope is to provide a coach for, well, no, hope, in fact, this is what we do at the moment, and our hope is to continue this. We provide a coach to every single planter. So husband and wife, separate coach. Kathy Hurd leads the wives network, and so we have a coaching network for the husbands and wives, because they're in this together, married couples, when they're married, and they have different roles, but boy oh boy, when they work as a team within that, understanding how to complement and work with one another, the impact is significant. So the coaching network, coaches for our planters happen around 6 to 12 months prior to planting. And then around 3 years post-planting, we provide a coach that meets with them every month. It's not just the kind of warm hug, although it is that, the coaching. It is a deliberate relationship. So it's around the gospel. So we talk about gospel coaching. Scott Thomas and Tom Wood's excellent book on gospel coaching is similar to the model we use over here, but it's around helping people move from where they are to where they've articulated they want to be. That is, plant this church, being healthy themselves, having a healthy marriage, having a healthy church that honours God, and reaching the people. So coaching is specifically around that. It's not just a warm hug when we have a chat so you feel better, although sometimes it is, because planting's hard, but it is helping them grow the skills and get to that point where, they feel like God is calling. So that's how we run coaching. It's absolutely key for us.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I think that just from my experience looking back over the years where church plants haven't had a coach, they've been very, very fragile. And having ongoing coaching to me is an absolute essential part of the package of church plants.
Oh, absolutely. When I planted, I didn't have a coach. Big mistake. You feel isolated. You feel lonely. You make mistakes, and it's good to have an outside voice saying to you things like, "No, that's normal. That's always what happens at this point," or to say, "No, that was stupid. You need to repent of that and don't do that again." So to have an outside voice who's a little bit more experienced or can point you in the right direction, huge. It's key.
That's great. Those two comments, that was normal and that was stupid. They're both absolutely invaluable. I'll take a note of that. I'll use that myself, I think. Now, tell us about how do you equip and train your church planters?
Yeah, we do it in a number of ways. Again, I think we've seen a key part of church planters being healthy and whole and doing well what they set out to do is connecting with other planters.
Yes.
So nearly all of our training that we provide is based around connection. So before we plant, we run a boot camp called Foundations, usually in the year before they plant, where we get all planters together in a room. Didn't happen. We did it online during COVID last year, and it was painful not to be in the same room. Everyone experienced that pain last year, but to have them in the same room where they connect in the trenches, working together, even though their models and contexts are quite different, working together, thinking through. So we run a boot camp for 3 days that pushes into gospel convictions, competencies. It's for husband and wives and for them all thinking together in the same room as to how they do it. So we run a boot camp. We have ongoing, we've got our national conference where we do training for that as well. We connect people into cohorts throughout the year. We also run, in terms of training is probably the wrong word for this, but it's part of having healthy marriages within the context of plans. Every year we take our planners in the first 3 years away to a marriage conference for 2 or 3 days, and they stay in a 5-star hotel without cost. And we do seminars on marriage for a couple of days where they get to spend time thinking through where they're at, because that reflection not only on the plan, which we do and is normally the bread and butter for church planning networks of thinking strategy, particularly for guys thinking strategy, how am I going to do, what problem am I going to solve, what's next? That moment to pause and pull back and say, how's our marriage going? That is part of our strengthening process for them. So we run a boot camp, we run ongoing training for 2 years, connecting cohorts online, sometimes generally face-to-face, but that marriage. There's some of the key ones. But at the heart of it is a connection, a peer learning network of church planners to keep sharpening older planners, sewing into younger planners in the same position, connecting with each other. That's the heart of it.
No, that's fantastic. That sounds so good, Derek. So good. We'll just wrap up in a moment, but if there was one tip that you would have for a church wanting to multiply, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. One tip. Can I give 2 tips?
Yes, you can.
Parts A and B?
Yes, parts A and B is fine.
Okay. The first one is you want to multiply healthy DNA. If you're not seeing people reached, there's no reason to think if you church plant, you will reach people if you're not doing it at the moment. So you need to work out how you missionally as a church are engaging with your community, whether you're doing it or not. And so don't think that church planning will solve all your problems. It won't. You may just be multiplying unhealthy DNA.
Yes.
That's the first one. Here's part B of that. If you're within a church and you want to multiply, you need to be deliberately raising up leaders to do that. You need to be deliberately investing in the next generation of leaders in order to multiply. You can only buy leaders for so long. You have to build leaders. And so if you want to multiply, you want a church plan, you need to build leaders. You need to stop buying them. It's a finite resource, that buying one. So, and if churches across Australia all began to get into this building leaders mindset, we would see a flood of church planners and people leading established churches and doing innovative ministries across Australia. But it starts at that local church level. You need to build leaders, not buy them.
That's brilliant advice, and I totally agree on both of those points. It's we're very much on the same wavelength. So, right. Derek, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, look, that's again a great question. I have very little, often profound things to say, and at this point, I think I'm staying true to form. Look, our hope is, as a network with Geneva Push and Reach Australia, our hope is to see overall thousands of healthy, evangelistic, multiplying churches across Australia, and we know we're one part of the ecosystem. We know that. And our hope is not to see that just happen through us. We know it won't. We want to play our part and do it well. But my encouragement would be to keep raising up that next generation of leaders. The established churches at the moment and the new church plants, they're the places those leaders are going to come from. We cannot outsource leadership development. I heard someone say, look, I'm getting on a roll here, I'm sorry. I heard someone say a while ago, I can think of leaders in churches who are much better leaders than I ever was and I ever will be. But the goal for me is not to outsource leadership development to them. Just like for my kids, I'm the only one who can be a father of my kids. There are people in our churches where we need to work out how we lead them, not outsource that leadership development to somewhere. We are called to shepherd the people there. So my call would be, whether you feel like you're inept, as I do as a father most of the time, inept as a leader, whatever else it might be, they're the people God has given you. So that's the question. How is it that I raise up and build these people to be the next generation of leaders across Australia who will reach the lost, who will grow God's church and honour him in that? There's my last thought that started out from nursing. I'm sorry that went a little bit long.
That was absolute gold. The whole conversation was gold, Derek. So, Derek, thank you so much for your time today and the wisdom that you've shared. And I love your heart. And thanks for all that you're doing to see multiplication happen around Australia. And I love the vision that you have for Geneva Push of seeing another 200 churches being planted over the next 10 years, which means that you've got to assess about 400 potential planters over that period of time. Absolutely thrilled to hear what you're doing. And, we really look forward to seeing what Geneva Push does in the years to come and to cheering you on every step of the way. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Great to talk.